I will start this video with a quote from Emmanuel Todt. What if democracy is merely the political superstructure of a particular cultural stage? Simple mass literacy. In that case, continuing advances in teaching and learning at the secondary and post-secondary levels will necessarily upset democracy in the places where it first appeared. Secondary education, and especially higher education, reintroduce the notion of inequality into the mental and ideological organization of developed societies. After a brief period of hesitation and scruples, the more highly educated wind up believing that they are truly superior. In developed countries, a new class is emerging that comprises roughly 20% of the population in terms of sheer numbers, but controls about half of each nation's wealth. This new class has more and more trouble putting up with the constraints of universal suffrage. It is a surprising return to the world of Aristotle, in which oligarchy may replace democracy. At the very moment when democracy is beginning to take hold in Eurasia, it is weakening in those places where it was born. These are indeed curious democracies, in which the political system pit elitism against populism and vice versa. And although universal suffrage persists in theory, in practice the elites of right and left close ranks to block any reorientation of economic policies that would lead to greater equality. The common understanding among the elite, a reflection of a common superior language among them, prohibits any cracking of the political system facade, when universal suffrage would suggest the possibility of crisis. End of quote. This quote is from Todt's 2001 book After the Empire, The Breakdown of the American Order. The book's main subject is the alleged decline of the American world order. I must admit that Todd's geopolitical analysis is somewhat questionable and encompasses many aspects I disagree with, as well as many predictions that just straight out turn out wrong. Democracy did not take anywhere near as firm a hold across Eurasia as it might have seemed at the time. Europe definitely did not surpass America's influence throughout the world, as Todd predicted in the book. However, Todd's sociological analysis of Western societies was remarkably prophetic. With the hindsight of more than 2 decades that have passed since the book was released, we can now firmly say that college education has become the most predictive factor of voting patterns and overall values throughout the Western world. As I have said in many of my previous videos, the most prominent political cleavage throughout the Western world can be characterized as a conflict between what I call global elitists and local populists. The terms somewheres and anywheres, as defined by David Goodhart, can be used as well. Anywheres are the people that define themselves much more by their personally achieved status, such as an educational level or a profession, than by any inherently common characteristics, such as nationality. The creative, college-educated classes living in the metropolitan areas that could, however, easily exchange Brussels for Tel Aviv, Sydney, Copenhagen or Dubai if they wanted to. They often feel more connection to other like-minded people around the world than to working class people from their own countries. The so-called somewheres are the people whose identity is much more bound by the locally shared ascribed characteristics, such as shared history, common appearance, religion, language or nationality. The political battle is waged throughout the West, one between the self-appointed protectors of liberal democracy and allegedly anti-democratic forces of right-wing populism. The paradox seems to be that the liberal Democrats seem to care much more about liberalism than about democracy. Either democracy will be liberal or there will be no democracy at all. It really is quite striking that in a number of countries where some politician who does not adhere to the dogmas of the contemporary liberal democratic theology succeeds, the political conflict is inevitably very soon framed as a struggle about the nature or even the preservation of democracy. In the United States, certain political and judicial power structures are quite openly trying to disqualify Donald Trump from participating in the elections by convicting him of numerous rather suspicious crimes. In Germany, the ban of the Alternative für Deutschland Party seems to be seriously contemplated by the chattering classes, and 45% of Germans supported this possibility in a poll in January of this year. In post-communist Europe, certain politicians or parties in Poland, Hungary or Slovakia are constantly being portrayed as nothing less than an imminent danger to democracy and the rule of law. The European Union has used a wide range of financial and legal means against them to undermine their political positions. In Israel, before the current war overshadowed these interpolitical disputes, there were massive anti-government protests over the proposed judicial reform that were framed as an attempt to curtail the independence of the judicial branch by the executive powers, similar to the situation in Poland. That is not to say that Viktor Orbán Benjamin Netanyahu or Donald Trump could not have possibly done or attempted to do some questionable deeds. They probably did. That is not the point though. The point is that there is no way in hell that any political subject popular among the college-educated classes would ever be subjected to the same ordeal, whatever he might do. The double standards are undeniable in this regard, if anyone looks at the issue honestly. While the circumstances vary from country to country, the basic pattern of these alleged threats to democracy is remarkably similar every time. There is a politician who enjoys significant support among certain strata of the electorate, but is absolutely despised by the college-educated populations. This politician usually deploys fairly brass and divisive language, often attacking the elites and immigrants, and is thus celebrated by the so-called ordinary working-class folk for telling it how it is, while being constantly labeled as dangerous, populist, racist, xenophobic or homophobic by the political opposition and the media. Sooner or later, this politician or a political party is inevitably accused of threatening democracy by undermining the independence of the press, judiciary power, or just vaguely defined civil society. If we are talking about a country in the European Union, the European Commission announces that it is very carefully watching the situation regarding the rule of law in a given country and is considering potential measures. Not long after, the politician or a government is getting bogged down in lawsuits, bureaucratic obstacles and such. Now, once again, this is not to claim that the mentioned politicians are some kind of lily-white symbols of moral integrity or innocence. Nor does it mean that I would necessarily think that their leadership would be enough to bring the West out of the civilizational decay. They mostly do not have the answers as well, but it definitely shows that the allegedly more enlightened, intelligent, wealthy, educated and moral part of the society, the one that does not hesitate to use accusations of authoritarianism, tends to be very authoritarian itself. The amusing thing is that most people in these social classes genuinely do not see the paradox at all. Throughout Western Europe, across all age groups, having university education is the best predictor of not voting for the parties commonly called populist or anti-system right. In France, the vote for Marine Le Pen's National Rally is strongly negatively correlated with the share of university graduates in any given municipality. It is a significantly stronger predictive factor than income levels. In the 2021 Dutch elections, only 15% of the Geert Wilders Party for Freedom voters had higher education. In the United States and Britain, the so-called diploma divide is a well-known issue. Education, not income, is the best predictor of Brexit or Trump support in a district. Why education? Education is a signal of worldview, not just material prosperity. Education and income are correlated, but it's possible to be a successful building contractor with no degree or a penniless graduate. In Britain, for instance, 16% of whites without degrees earn above average incomes, and 29% of whites with degrees are in the lowest income bracket. So, there are plenty of well-educated poor people and less educated wealthy people. The former tended to vote for Corbyn, the later for UKIP. That reflects values, not material position, since education is the strongest demographic predictor of a person's views on immigration and the EU. University-educated people are far more socially liberal than those without degrees. Studies based on sampling school children's views at age 13 shows that this is because liberal-minded people select into university education more than because university makes them liberal. If you know a person's income, your chance of guessing how they voted on Brexit is about 55%. Little better than chance. But if the only information you have on a person is whether they have a degree or not, this increases your accuracy to over 60%. Electoral maps based on aggregate county results matched to census data offered the first snapshot of the social drivers of Trump, and it was apparent that education, not income, best predicted Trump's success. End of quote. In Israel, even though the situation there is strongly affected also by religious and ethnic considerations, the higher the percentage of residents with tertiary education, the more people voted for the centrist, liberal Zionist parties and for left-wing parties, including Labour and Meretz, the parties that supported the anti-government protests in 2023. Conversely, the support for the Benjamin Netanyahu Likud party is concentrated among the less affluent, less educated working-class populations. In Germany, Germany, the vote for the AfD is strongly negatively correlated with the proportion of highly educated people in a given area. In opposition, the vote for the Green Party is by far best predicted by the share of people with a university education. In post-communist Europe, the well-known troublemakers and the democratic backsliders like Law and Justice in Poland, Fidesz in Hungary, or Robert Fico's Smer in Slovakia all copy the same general pattern. Those parties all electorally depend on the populations with lower levels of education and are largely despised by the more well-off, urban, younger and educated people. In the Czech Republic, in recent polls, Andrej Babiš's party ANO reached 48% support among young people with only primary education, while only 10% of university students supported him. Tertiary education neatly correlates with other sociological factors, namely income, urbanization, and, to a certain extent, age. But, again, the research repeatedly shows that education levels do have the best predictive value when it comes to political support for the so-called populist, anti-system right. Basically, whenever you read in your highly credible mainstream media outlet that in some Western country, democracy might be threatened by authoritarian tendencies, you can guess with 100% certainty that the politician at hand is supported by the people who have not been enlightened by the secrets of higher education. So, what to make of it all? Well, it is sort of becoming a meme at this point, but once again, Emmanuel Todt can help us with his unorthodox thoughts. As was already mentioned in the quote in the introduction of this video, Emmanuel Todt puts great emphasis on the general levels of education in societies. The spread of universal literacy was a necessary precursor for the gradual rise of secularization, industrialization, urbanization, the initial fall of fertility rates, and the creation of mass political movements, whether democratic or totalitarian. Throughout the 20th century, most developed countries embarked on the project of pretty much universal levels of primary and very high levels of secondary education. However, in the second half of the 20th century, approximately from the Second World War onwards, a third educational revolution occurred, one connected to higher or college education. Traditionally, only a tiny proportion of the population has received higher education throughout the modern period. These were mostly the adherents of elite social classes, which were rather small on a societal level, while the majority of the social body was on a relatively egalitarian educational level, which fostered social cohesion observable in the post-war decades. However, unlike the previous educational projects, which were pushed to either universal or close to universal levels, the progress of tertiary education clearly shows both the limits of the educational revolution. The proportion of college graduates seemed to hover at around 40% in most developed countries, as well as the societal pathologies it created. To put it simply, the rise of college education stratified Western societies into two social blocks with very different economic interests, values, and political opinions. In the modern, service-based knowledge economy, a college education is still a necessary precursor for entrance into these metropolitan areas' concentrated economic hubs and a comfortable middle-class existence. Sure, there are some exceptions. One can definitely make a good living as a self-employed artisan or craftsman. However, the correlation between income and education is still remarkably strong. As was demonstrated in the previous chapter, the rise of the so-called populist right in the Western world is a protest of those without college education against the college-educated classes. The traditional reaction to this fact is either a contempt for the poor, bitter, uneducated masses of backward-thinking simpletons, or some well-meant condescending statement about the fact that those poor people just do not have sufficient education or erudition to gain orientation in the increasingly confusing world full of populism or even Russian-funded misinformations. In the Czech Republic, two nicknames are commonly used for these two parts of the society. The supporters of the populist parties are called dezoláti, which basically means bums, frustrated, uneducated, stupid, poorly dressed people who write comments full of grammatical mistakes in capital letters about issues they obviously know nothing about. And on the other hand, the other half of the society is sarcastically called lepší lidi, which just means the better people. That is quite self-explanatory. It just points to the fact that these people ooze the unshakable feeling of just being better, more educated, civilized, wealthier, moral, and so on. In the current atmosphere, in which the global elitist side controls the capital, education, media, cultural institutions, governmental bureaucracies, or international organizations, the elections are the only area where the people left behind in the knowledge-based economy can let their voices be heard. The key issue seems to be that in the current economic environment, in which the highly interconnected metropolitan economic hubs carry the economy of their countries, the college-educated classes sort of do not know what to do with their less fortunate compatriots. Many of the lower-skilled manufacturing jobs have been outsourced overseas. A lot of the low-skilled service jobs are cheaply performed by immigrants. There inevitably is a certain strata of society that just isn't cognitively equipped to meaningfully contribute to the knowledge-based economy. Many of the jobs these folks hold might be wiped out by automation in the coming years. In a world where the strength of the bonds connecting people based on their shared nationality or ethnicity is weakening in favor of a more cosmopolitan international class consciousness, the current system offers very little other than resentment to those left behind by the economic and cultural zeitgeist. Apart from economic disagreements, which mostly stem from the division between those who profit from globalization and those who feel they do not, it breeds a host of ethical issues, the so-called culture wars. To quote William Vogley, disputes over questions of respect, decency, and identity, personal and national, are harder to resolve. The universal viewpoint favored by the college-educated and the particular disposition more common to the working class led to differences that cannot be split over issues like abortion, gender identity, immigration, gun control, and vigorous law enforcement that has disparate impact on racial minorities. End of quote. The issues mentioned are obviously from the American context, but the basic point applies elsewhere as well. But then, there also is the other side of the coin, and that is the fact that the college-educated ruling classes seem to be more and more prone to coming up with very conformist and sort of retarded political choices. Whether immigration policy, many forms of response to the COVID pandemic, certain aspects of the transgender issue, and a lot of the environmentalist policies that just defy the laws of physics, every time large parts of the allegedly science-based and expert-driven elites pushed stuff that one could sort of see is very fishy just by using a common-sense approach. Now, college education is obviously indispensable for the functioning of modern, developed countries and the scientific technological civilization as a whole. But it is also true that there has been a relatively large-scale overproduction of graduates who do not really have that much to contribute to the economy and tend to parasite on the system. Mainly the graduates of various humanity fields that have been completely ideologically hijacked by the radical left and now serve as a never-ending sources of new apparatchiks for the various non-profit organizations and newsrooms leeching onto taxpayers' money, ever-expanding academic staff, corporate HR departments, and various new and completely useless professions, like media discourse analysts or disinformation experts. The left has always been the biggest proponent of educational expansion. Now, that is an honorable goal by itself, but it is also a vehicle of leftists' power, since they very well know that they have won the culture war and ideologically dominate higher education. And its expansion is thus also an expansion of their power. Recently, Christopher Caldwell has written a great essay about the contemporary political and social situation in Israel. I'm going to quote part of it now. The state of Israel might have a constitutional need for its progressives, especially for their worldliness, which is to say, their godlessness. Whether to be part of the wider world, at the risk of losing yourself, your culture, your connection to God, or to keep to yourself at the risk of provinciality and lost economic opportunity, is a decision that faces all peoples and individuals. Let us say that one sociological pole of Israeli life is represented by the Haredi scholar, spending his days in a study in a schoolroom in Jerusalem. The other pole is a software engineer, who spent his rich, secular childhood on the beach in Tel Aviv, but now lives, like 100,000 other Israelis, in Silicon Valley. Both are worthy lives. Neither is more Jewish. But when so many of the Jewish people's eggs are put in the vulnerable basket of Israel, which of these lives get chosen is no longer a matter of indifference. How does a people of 10 million in possession of a great culture defend itself against another people, also in possession of a great culture, but stubbornly hostile, and dozens of times Israel's size, by being efficient in war? To defend itself, Israel must be rich enough to get efficient weapons. It must be connected enough to the world to stay at the cutting edge of science. So, if Israel is to survive, there must be some principle, creating a preference for the worldly over the godly. End of quote. I think these words have, to a certain extent, universal application. The most educated, and thus economically productive, strata of societies in basically all developed countries, especially in the Western world, are usually the most liberal, in both the cultural and economic sense of the word. If you ever visit a town where the parties or politicians of the so-called populist right are strongest, it is very rarely a thriving place. Usually, it is a smaller, aging town, without college, with a low proportion of people with tertiary education, and thus a certain lack of the vibrant economic and cultural life connected to the youthful, educated population. The high echelons of the economy are inevitably globalized and, therefore, cosmopolitan. It is one of the biggest challenges for the emerging intellectual right to break this sort of connection of the right-wing political views with the less successful, less productive parts of the society. That will be especially challenging with young, female, college-educated voters, who have become the most reliable backbone of the current ideological orthodoxy. It will be fascinating to observe if the electoral successes of any of the political entities operating on the populist right will genuinely be transformed into real political gains. As alluded to in the opening quote by Emmanuel Todd, the college-educated classes throughout the Western democratic world do not seem to feel bound by the voice of the people anymore. It is more of a nuisance for them. We are dealing with the large-scale and multifactored impacts of the expansion of tertiary education. It created numerous, ideologically and economically powerful professional managerial class that control the gears of businesses and public opinion via the media and academia. It also dominates most state and international organization bureaucracies and judiciary bodies. Expansion of the power of these institutions is inherently in the interest of the professional managerial classes. However, it is increasingly questionable whether it is in the interest of society as a whole. Belonging to this social class and its inner solidarity is often subconscious, and you can find people with very different political views regarding the left-right axis. The key seems to be the division between parties that are seen as respectable and reasonable, not shaking the status quo too much in either direction, and those seen as anti-system and populist. This class is nevertheless also defined by remarkable conformism and complacency. The massive indoctrination of these classes by various currently trending ideological streams is primarily a result of complacency and fear of losing the accumulated position, rather than factual persuasion. The clash between this class and the remnants of the native working classes in developed countries seems to define our current political period.